Now that we're done modeling the character and sculpting the character, now let's take a look at how to UV map the character. UV mapping just means taking the character, laying it flat so it can be ready for textures. Before we do that, I'm just going to hold down Control Shift, kind of get back to my viewport here. But let's not forget that we changed some settings in sculpting. So if you are coming from sculpting, you want to make sure that you set this back. So I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences, and I want to make sure that Input, Uncheck Emulate Through Button Mouse. So go ahead and open up Preferences, go into Input, and make sure that that's turned off. Otherwise, the settings in UV mapping are not going to work. Now I'm going to go back to modeling here, and I can see that here's our model. It still has the exact same, poly count that we had before, okay, when we modeled it originally. And over here you can see on the multi-resolution modifier, this is the viewport. Okay, so if I click on this, I'm going to be able to start to see the details. You'll notice I'm not seeing them now, but if I go into object mode, I can see it here. And if I bring this back down, it's like I'm going through the different layers. And you might say, well, why wouldn't I always want it to be at the highest? Well, that can really slow down the viewport. Let's say if you're animating or doing something along those lines. So what that means is that you could keep the viewport at level 0, so it's going to be nice and fast for the computer. And then when you go into sculpting mode, it's going to be at your highest at 4. Or if you render it, you can see that when you render it, in other words, put rendering and lighting and final image, it'll also be at the highest detail. So when we UV map this, we're going to UV map it at the lowest. Okay, it would be a nightmare to try to do it at the highest. But I can see kind of moving right along here. We started with modeling, then we did sculpting. Now let's take a look at UV mapping. So if I click on UV editing, I'm going to go ahead and close the image planes. I don't really need those anymore. I'll even select this one, put it in there as well. Okay, great. Now I've got my character here at, again, the lowest, but again, he didn't lose any detail. It's still there. It's potentially there. And here's my UV map. So I'm going to cut this guy up and lay him here. If we want to look at what it looks like now, if I hit Tab and if I press A for all, this is what it looks like now. And if you imagine this as a coloring book, it doesn't really make any sense. So if I had a tattoo on his arm that said I love Blender, I don't know where I would paint that over here. Okay, so that's kind of a telltale sign that it's not ready for texturing. So there's going to be a few things that we're going to be using. We're going to be, if I come in here, I can see that there's a lot of different menus that we're going to be looking at. Also here, if I click on this, this will flip. Okay, so this will flip between vertex, edge, and face. And then this is going to be the UV shell mode. I can also see here, if I open this up, these are my tools for the UV area. And over here, I can switch this. I can go to object or edit mode. I don't need to be in sculpting mode, okay? And then here under edge, mark seam is going to be important. So I'm going to be doing mark seam to kind of cut this guy up. And instead of me always finding mark seam, I could right click on it and I could say assign to quick favorites. And you can see that I already have it set to quick favorites. Because now if I press Q, that's my quick favorites. And you can see that I have mark, seam, and unwrap. Looks like I also have sharp edges, but mark, seam, and unwrap are really the only two that we need. So I'm going to go to UV, mark, seam, and then I'm going to find unwrap and put that up in there as well. So here's unwrap, I right click, and I'm going to say assign to quick favorites. Now when I'm doing stuff, I can just hit Q and then my menu comes up. This is true not only for UVs but for anything. So we could do this when we're modeling or any of these other areas. So now that we have kind of a starting point, in the next lesson we'll actually begin cutting this guy up and kind of seeing what that looks like.